for folks who can't be with us on the class to join us. And we've had several folks taking the class at other times during the week and looking at the PowerPoint. So that's been really cool that others can participate. You'll also see along the bottom, perhaps, a breakout room icon. In just a minute, what we usually do at the beginning of our sessions is break out and talk a little bit about some topics that we talked about from last week or some setup material for this week. We also want to call to your attention the bottom left-hand corner, which is where you can mute yourself. And I think all of you have done this enough to know how to do that. So when we're not talking, we just mute so that we kind of cut off the ambient background noise of animals, children, whatever else is going on in our household. So let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer, and then we'll do some screen sharing and get started with the class tonight. Great to have you all with us. Let's pray. We give you thanks, God, for the gift of this week and for the ways that you have been at work in our lives, perhaps stirring our souls and awakening our imaginations with new understandings that are coming from our time together. We pray, God, that you'll continue to open us and give us those courageous minds and hearts and voices to be a people who speak and imagine and live into a new reality where we celebrate all of the differences between us and the ways you unite us for faithful ministry as your people and as your church. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. I see Len's joining us too, which is great. I don't think we've had Len Nelson with us. So you may be on the second screen. If you're on a computer, we probably have enough folks now. We have 21 folks, so you might have to click to the left or the right of your picture screens, and that'll show you the breadth of the faces. And I think iPads, you can do that too, where you can look at the different faces that way. So great to have everybody with us tonight. Let me go ahead and share our screen.
We're going to take those gloves off.
Just a second.
Or put the data in the mobile APIS.
Or maybe, Ken, could you share your screen with our opening?
Now you can scan the rep and put the
And you're muted. Ken or Len, welcome. I'm going to mute you while you're getting set up here, my friend. There we go. And if you just go, Ken, to the slideshow at the top and click on slideshow, it should just give you the whole presentation there. Where did that dude go? It was just up there a minute ago.
Amy, go over to the right. It should say presentation.
Yeah. Let me do this. I can go ahead and let me go ahead and I think I can screen share now, Ken.
Okay, I'm unmuted now, so I can go for it again.
Okay, if you want to put yours up, that'd be great.
Okay, I think this is it. And then how do I make that so it just shows the screen, the pictures? You're seeing it now, aren't you?
Yeah, on view.
On
view.
Go, present.
There you go.
How's that look? Well,
it'll come up. And then, yeah, then your arrows are at the bottom left, so you can advance those as we go. That'd be great. Thanks.
Okay.
So again, our learning objective, we put that up every time just to remind ourselves that while we are trying to create a safe place for conversations, one of the ways we kind of break out of our white fragility is by allowing ourselves in that space to be nudged into uncomfortable discussions and feelings. As we're challenging our frameworks of white privilege and stereotypes. So especially this week, we're beginning to shift now to thinking about being and living into being racially sensitive individuals and part of the Christian community. What does it mean to be the white church and have a witness to make as the white church through these conversations about white fragility? So we're going to be moving into that today. Then the next slide just reminds us a little bit about our learning experiences together, making sure that we're making space and taking space, especially in our small groups, to make sure that everybody gets an opportunity to not only speak but also be heard, and really not creating a space of judgment, but just a space of awareness and growing in grace and faith together. The next slide is the centering moment. This actually comes from Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail that was written in 1963. So some of us, if you just kind of quickly place yourself wherever you were in your life at that time, I wasn't here yet, but many of us were. And so just place yourself in that time. And we're just going to take about 2 minutes now to just read the centering moment and just get ourselves into some of the space that King's calling us into to do our work for tonight. So I'll be quiet for about 2 minutes and just take an opportunity to read that and do a little reflection. This is kind of a tough one for many of us to read, especially in the white progressive and white moderate voice that many of us represent, being a part of, especially the mainline white church. An interesting story about this letter from a Birmingham jail. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I'd encourage you to Google it and read it. It's like it was written for right now. And it was written by King primarily to white moderates, especially white clergy, about kind of their lukewarm response to the civil rights movement. And some folks argued that that we should open the canon, which means that we should consider even opening the Bible and include or explore including this word from the letter from the Birmingham jail into our canon, into our scriptures. It was that profound of a witness. So I'd invite you to take that opportunity to read that, but especially to hear what he's saying about this lukewarm acceptance, and are we out of our need as even the white church, out of our need to kind of create more civil discourse and more order? Are we leaning into this kind of work in order just to kind of pacify and quell and satisfy people? Or are we ready really to march? Are we ready for the kind of acts of resistance against white superiority? So that's a challenge for us to think about tonight. Okay, our breakout groups. Last week I invited you to take the race IAT. This is an implicit bias test. Those of you who weren't a part of our study last week or didn't do it online and don't know what we're talking about, what this is an opportunity through a Harvard study to actually take an inventory to see about how we have bias just because of our own white experience in a white nation, to take time to understand our own bias. So if you did not get a chance to take this implicit bias test, I invite you to be a listener to those who were, so that they can share a little bit about what they learned, and that might spark some of your thinking about your own bias. The information about this bias test can be found in session 4's recording and the PowerPoint. So if you would like to take it, or any one of the other implicit bias tests, that's located on that session. And then we also talked last week about developing an elevator speech. Part of the thesis of D'Angelo is that part of the reason that racism gets propagated in our American culture is because we don't talk about it. And it's a part of our rules of white engagement not to talk about race, or to make it about the other and not about ourselves and our own bias. So for those of you that had an opportunity to think about what your ideas about your elevator speech would be, how would you begin a conversation or involve a conversation about learning and talking about race and some of the things you're learning in this class? So Ken, if you go ahead, or let me ask, first of all, those of you that would like to take a photo of this screenshot from your phone or just jot down these questions, we'll be losing the image of these questions now as we go into our breakout groups. But we'll spend about 20 minutes now spending time in groups of 3 talking about these 2 questions. For some of you that are just joining us for the first time, make sure you spend just a moment to get acquainted with the small group that you're with in case you're seeing some unfamiliar faces. So Ken, if we could go ahead and stop the screen share. And then we have 21, perfect. So we'll put everybody in groups of 3, 7 groups of 3. So again, we'll spend about 20 minutes and I'll give you a reminder when we come back to go ahead and gather back. So thanks for joining in, having those conversations with one another.
Amy, did you see D'Angelo? She was on PBS NewsHour.
I didn't, but several folks did, and they said it was a really great interview. We need to post that on our website. Under our faith and race section of the website, of our Arvada Church website, so it's arvadaumc.org/faith and race. If you click on the icon, Sue Clausen, do you want to share a little bit about this talk that'll be happening tomorrow?
Well, it's by Candy, who wrote the How to Be an Anti-Racist, one of the bestsellers amongst the Black current literature. And it's being presented by the Prince George's County, Maryland library system in cooperation with a lot of other systems. And I think it's either on at 4 or 5. But you can go on our website and get a link to make a reservation.
Now, when we made the reservation, but we had to claim that we were following a certain, we were associated with a certain library back there, because the register button wouldn't become active until you checked one of the libraries.
I didn't do that.
Really? Ours
No.
did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Although I could legitimately say, because we used to live in Maryland, that I had used one of the other systems, which wasn't even listed.
So choose a library, and if you get an opportunity, it should be a really good session, and one that's like Sue was saying, an author who's wildly followed right now and doing some great work in scholarship around these topics. So thanks for that. So we got an opportunity to talk a little bit about our implicit bias, and you may have had all kinds of different reservations or experiences of that implicit bias test, but let me just encourage you to let that experience and the feelings that it evoked and things like that just continue to work on you a little bit. I find that having done it a couple years ago, last year, I guess, with the bishop and the cabinet, there's still some awarenesses that continue to be within me about that. I'm getting some feedback, guys, so go ahead and mute if you're not speaking, and that'll help us make sure that we're not getting a lot of background noise. I think we've got everybody pretty well taken care of. Thank you for that. Also, in your elevator speech, was there an awareness that came to your mind, just briefly, about finding words to speak about racism? We're going to talk a little bit about how and to whom we're talking about that with through our class tonight. But any feelings about that? How's that going? Is it hard to find language? I found that this week. And I'm usually not one that's looking for words, right? So what were some other experiences you had as you're trying to find language and put together that kind of an elevator speech?
I don't know the exact language, Amy, but in my group I was sharing that I deepened the understanding through this book that it is the crucial responsibility of the white community to have these discussions and to continue the forums to discuss. And then the other element was that we need to look to them what they want rather than having us move forward for problem solving.
Mm. It's great awareness, Catherine.
So,
Go ahead.
Robin, then Carolyn?
okay. When you were asking about words, one thing that trips me up is the word racism because, until I started learning more about it, and even still today, when my first instinct when somebody talks about racism is, oh, that doesn't apply to me.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but it's such a bigger topic. And so you find out all the ways that it does apply to you, but I still, it takes some mental exercise to get there every time.
Good point, Robin. And taking us back to that good and bad binary, that chapter, even using that word elicits bad, broken. And we don't want to be in that space. So yeah, we got to figure out some new definitions. Great. Carolyn?
Well, I was looking for some Black-owned businesses, and but the thing I started with was the person I asked said, well, you just had a Black notary at a refinance. And so I called her up to ask her if she knew of any other Black businesses in this side of town. But I felt really awkward about what I was going to say. But what I did say was that I didn't think it was enough to talk or listen about this, that we thought we needed to do something. That's all I said. But she seemed to take it positively. And so we haven't gotten too much further, but we did find a good Black restaurant. Boney's Barbecue downtown is excellent.
Good to know.
So now we got two.
Thanks for the courage and just taking the risk of asking that question. That was great.
I had a perhaps opportunity to have such a conversation just before we talked about elevator speeches last week. And the main thing I came up with was to start talking about what I had read and what I had seen, and not accusing anybody of being racist, certainly, or you should think about, but I have been reading about all the barriers that Blacks face, something like that.
So starting with the I, and not starting with the you. Everything right now is very you-focused, criticism, judgment, and we know that instantly puts people on the defensive. So even leading into that, Lindy, around starting with what I'm learning, where I'm at, that's really healthy starting place.
I find that the book is a really, easy way to kind of get into the conversation because everybody's kind of reading something. I mean, some are novels and some are whatever, but when somebody says, what are you reading? You can say, this is what I'm reading. And they go, usually it's like, oh, what's that about? And so then it's, I usually just talk in general terms about the fact that I'm learning lots about racism, not as a negative, but as just something that we are all a part of, that we all have to claim our place in it, that it's something that we all have to work on, and trying to make it not a finger pointing, kind of experience, so that somebody doesn't feel like I'm just attacked or pointed a finger or anything like that, but kind of an invitation, I guess I should be saying. It's an invitation to kind of think with me about what it means for to experience racism in our world, and how we as white people. I try not to use the words white privilege and things like that right off the bat, because those I found a long time ago when my daughter used them on Tim and I. She's a social worker, so she, years ago, she started talking to her dad about his white privilege one time when he'd done something. I don't remember what it was, but she says, you realize you're operating out of white privilege. And so that was our initial part, but that was probably, 8 or 10 years ago that we were introduced to that. But I know from that experience not to just start in there. Because people are very offended and don't listen much beyond that unless you're fairly close to them.
Love that you choose the we versus the they. A lot of times, formerly the conversation would start they, right? Well, they're marching, they're in the streets, they've got Black Lives Matter. We use that we language, and that's a really important image to use when we're talking about white fragility. So Ken's going to be, thank you all, is going to be taking us into how do we have these conversations and why is it hard, and especially with people whom we love the most, right? That can be some of the hardest work of all. So to get us into that space, I'm going to remind us just real briefly about some of our responsibility as Christian people, as followers of Jesus in this work. And then Ken's going to take us into some of the deeper conversations of white fragility. So I'll pull up my screen real quickly, Ken. So tonight, we want to build on chapters 9 and 10 with a couple of core topics. The first one, what's the role of the church and us being a part of the church? And we're going to talk about the prophetic role, the priestly role, and the political role. And then we're going to shift to Ken, who's going to talk with us about talking to fragile white friends. I love that. In the terms of white or intersectionality and self-interest. So these will be kind of our learning content work that we're going to be doing now for just a few minutes. To start off the role of the church, the prophet, priest, and politic, I was watching a commentary this week, someone on the news who was talking about Martin Luther King's witness. And what they said was Martin Luther King was not a political leader. He was a prophetic moral leader. And I had a real problem with that assessment because as a follower of Jesus and as a pastor himself, it connoted a difference or a distinction between politic and prophet. Between kind of moral leadership and political leadership. And that's really not the very nature of discipleship, and it's definitely not the nature of Jesus' ministry. So a historical understanding of Jesus' ministry is as prophet, priest, and king. There's some problematic parts to this, especially around the king issue, but we'll talk about that in just a moment. But what this is called historically and through the Catholic, but also through the our ecumenical church is minus triplex, which means the threefold office. And what historically we know is that in the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, typically a person was one of three things in the scriptures of the Old Testament. They were a prophet, and we know who those prophets were throughout the Old Testament. We preached about one this morning, Amos, Jeremiah, Isaiah. Then we have priests who moderated and were really kind of a go-between between God and the people. Priests like Samuel and Eli. And then kings. We had good kings, and then we had bad kings throughout the Old Testament. Of course, King David is the first one that comes to mind. But what's essential to our understanding about Jesus is that he is prophet, priest, and king. So he is someone who is both the mouthpiece of God beyond the world as we know it. And interestingly, the Hebrew word for prophet is nabi. And there's kind of an edge in that Hebrew word of a madman, of a crazy person. And there's something about every prophet in the Hebrew scriptures that makes them somehow pointing to a vision of a world that doesn't exist yet. And Jesus encompasses a part of that prophetic work, obviously, in his ministry and in his personhood. Then the role in Jesus of the priest. And Hebrews talks about Jesus as the high priest, the intercessor, the one that goes between God and humanity, and who literally prays for humanity, prays for our brokenness and redeems us out of that brokenness. And then king, another way that we understand Jesus as a king, in the sense of his leadership is guiding us to live under the authority of God's vision for humankind. So when we think about Jesus in these three ways, we also need to think about the church in these three ways. The church as the body of Christ is also to have a prophetic, a priestly, and I would use instead of king, a political role in confronting white fragility. And what happens so many times in our culture is we tend to separate out those three things. So if someone is a prophet, they're out there marching and they kind of have a craziness about them to live into this vision of the world as it isn't yet, but it has yet to be. Or we have the priest, the one who's kind of pastorally interceding on behalf of the people, or the politic. But we cannot understand Jesus of Nazareth separating any of those three things. Remember, he was crucified not only by the Roman emperor, but he was also crucified by the jeers of the people of the temple. So his ministry and his witness and his identity is as prophet, priest, and a political being. So we need to think about, as a church, what's our role in confronting white fragility in those ways? How are we called to be a prophetic voice, speaking God's truth to God's people? Well, we might say, well, that happens in preaching and teaching, but that isn't just the pastor's job. We can be prophetic in our mentoring, in our relating to one another, and casting a vision of the way the world should be. We are also called as the church to be priestly and somehow connecting people to the heart of God. And we do that by sustaining ritual. I'm amazed at the witness that the church is giving to our nation right now about the work that we're doing about staying together, even virtually, worshiping together, praying together, serving together. That's a priestly function. It's saying to the world, you know, when all kinds of hell breaks loose in our country right now, we still persist in our daily disciplines of worship and prayer and servanthood. That's a priestly function. Well, how do we keep doing that work as we're confronting white fragility? And then the third thing we need to be thinking about as a church is the political or the politic. How are we inviting people to live under the authority of God's vision? Now, most mainline United Methodists are not searching for a theocracy, building a culture that's focused on the worship of God, or assuming that everyone in our American culture is Christian, or living under the authority of God in the way that we know God in Jesus Christ. But how are we called in confronting white fragility through guiding policy, through voting, through advocacy? Robin Kupernick, who's on our class tonight, is doing a lot of work with the Tax Act right now, and she's linking and understanding, and our social justice team understanding the work of advocacy and voting around that act in Colorado to social justice and making sure that all people have access to having their voices heard. That's a way that we are living into the politic of confronting white fragility. One author that I read said, you know, usually what the white church does when there's a flare up, in his words, of kind of like the Black Lives Matter movement right now, we do three things. We educate, we dialogue, and we pray. We educate, dialogue, pray. We educate, dialogue, pray. And what I want us to think about is moving ourselves and living differently as the church, instead of just educating and dialoguing and praying, to thinking about how are we going to be prophetic? How are we going to connect people to the heart of God through this? And how are we going to live politically to guide people and to advocate for a new vision of God's vision and dream for humankind? So Ken's going to take us now into some practices and some thinking about how we can do this as we're confronting white fragility as the church and as Christian people. So Ken, I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to let you share from your screen.
Okay, here we are. So I want to talk about the fragility of our friends when we're when we're talking with them, or even when they raise questions for us. And to begin that, I picked up a quote that's on page 120 from D'Angelo, where she's talking about the person that she was in conflict about because she had confronted this person about racism. And she goes through how the fragility just keeps getting expressed in a variety of ways. And her next move takes racism off the table and replaces it with an oppression she experiences, sexism. So I thought I'd jump off from that to talk about a topic that's been called intersectionality. And intersectionality is defined as we all have multiple identities. We're not just white people or Hispanics. We're parents. I'm a senior citizen. We have a variety of multiple identities, and that oppression doesn't really have a hierarchy. And this is particularly true for Christians. Believe that everyone who's oppressed needs to be set free from that oppression, or the oppression needs to be addressed. So intersectionality, words that have more than 3 syllables shouldn't give me so much trouble. This is a statement that the Black Lives Matter organization has made. We're guided by the fact that all Black lives matter, regardless of actual or perceived sexual identity, gender expression, economic status, ability, disability, religious beliefs or disbeliefs, immigration status, or location. They could have gone on and on. But the point being, which is that you can't just say, oh, well, there's a Black person and their life matters, and that we're going to not worry about the oppression that comes from a low economic status or from someone who has a disability. So respecting a fragile friend's experience of oppression, I would argue, can be an opening to talk about oppression, including racism. So that whereas one way that people can let us know, well, I'm not going to talk about racism because I'm a woman and I got fired 3 times and I get paid half as much as a man and so on, is to begin with openness to the whole idea of oppression, to discuss with them oppression, and so that it becomes a way that we can open a discussion with fragile friends, and to make that discussion not beginning with racism, but move towards being able to discuss the oppression that comes with not having white skin, so that's just one thing I thought I'd kind of open with as we're thinking about a variety of strategies for how we can talk to fragile white friends. The second one I'd like to talk about comes out of some research that was published in 2019. So this is something that D'Angelo had no way to know anything about, because the research was done after she'd even written her book. And it was done with really extensive resources, where they used focus groups and surveys. And then they kept, in the focus groups, they would refine the discussion, refine the questions, and also with a series of surveys, they were able to kind of get a deeper understanding about how racism is working and looking at class conflict. The way that Bernie Sanders chose that he was going to argue that we shouldn't be worried about racism. What we need to do is solve the class problem, the inequity in our economic system. And when we solve the inequity, then everyone of all races will be raised up, and the problem of racism will disappear because we've got an economic system that works well for all people. They challenged that and wanted to really understand how the race and the class argument have worked together. What they discovered is that Americans can be divided into three different groups. There's the left base. The left base is 23%. The people that these are the folks who we think left, we think democratic, although in fact what they discovered is it wasn't just down political lines. There's the right base, where again we think, oh, that's Republicans, but this is the people that are just solidly there. And then that there were the persuadables. This is not just the majority, more than both the left and the right combined. So let's look more closely at that left base. The left base believes that a small group of wealthy people control the economy and the government for their personal gain. They believe that racism is one of the weapons that the wealthy and the elite use in order to accomplish their control of the economy and of the government. And this base believes that racism is morally wrong. The left base wants America to be a country with economic security and opportunity for all. The left base includes an advocacy community they discovered. These are kind of like the left. They're the folks who are concerned about past injustices and that they want to talk about structural and institutional racism. The number that they used for this is actually fairly small. Of the total American population, they were looking at just 4 or 5% of Americans that would fall into this advocacy community on the left. The right base, they believe that government interventions undercut the free market and stifle individual initiative. They believe that people of color are unsuccessful because in a free market, it's their character that determines whether they're successful or not. They believe that white people deserve economic advantages that they experience, again, back to because of their character or because of their history. And they don't like to talk about racism. The persuadables, these are the people that it's important not to just think of these as these are people that have a centralist view or something that cuts the middle. They have a clear, distinct perception, according to this research, a way of looking at the world. And the way that persuadables, this group looks at the world, is that they believe that a small group of wealthy people control the economy and government for their personal gain. They believe that racism is one of the weapons that the wealthy and the elite use in order to gain this control of the economy and the government. They worry about the impact of anti-racism on the economy and their personal security. This is the way that they're going to be impacted is something that is a worrisome to them. And they don't like to talk about racism. This shouldn't surprise us from reading D'Angelo's book and all of the things that she explains about the fragility and the uncomfortableness and the desire not to talk about race, which this would show that both of the right base and the persuadables would prefer not to have a direct conversation about race. So let's just quickly, talking to the right base. The right base is not really interested in hearing the perspective of the left base. And we've probably all run into people who just, they think that they know how things are and they've got their perspective, and why would they want to listen to an idea about the importance of providing education for all children on an equal basis, because it's a matter of how hard people work at school. They have their perspective. The right base doesn't see the right perspective as racist. They don't think of themselves as racist. They don't. Sometimes it's surprising, but this research really brought out the thing that when you survey people about whether they even think that President Trump is a racist, well, they don't perceive him as a racist. It all comes down in many ways to definitions in that case, but still, that's their perception, is that they are not racist. And so to find common ground is extremely difficult with this 1 in 5 people in America. So when you're talking to, when you confront someone, if you just took a random sample of people in the elevator, there's going to be 1 in 5 who is going to be in the right base. And it takes a great deal of just listening before there can be any kind of conversation out about racism, or even about the economy with the right base. So talking to the left base, well, that's a lot of fun. Those are our friends. And I think I really like the way D'Angelo kind of helps us see that this should be an opportunity to identify our own fragility, that when we're talking with people in the left base, that again, it's about 1 in 5 people that I run into. Any of our friends that fall into this case or relatives, then it's also a way for us to increase our understanding of our own race-based ideas, to discover our own fragility, and to move beyond where we are as people that want to become anti-racist. So talking to persuadables, this is the majority of people in America. So one way to approach them is notice or recognize that just jumping right in isn't it terrible what's happening with African Americans. Since this research was done in 2018 and 2019, I think it would be interesting to see the extent to which there's been some shifting in this, particularly with the awareness of the violence against African Americans by police and the increasing awareness across the country. But I think we still need to be sensitive to not just assuming that everybody that we meet is automatically seeing that social justice is really at the top of their list. They're probably not interested in a lecture about dog whistle politicians. Last week we talked about dog whistling and the way that the elite and politicians in particular will set us up for claiming that black people are undeserving or people of color are undeserving, and then using that as a way to frighten us into thinking we need more police, and we need to make sure that we don't have the government holding back the good people who want to work hard and use their character to get ahead, and that this dog whistling probably isn't the first place to jump into the conversation. But the persuadables will recognize that progressive, inclusive government helps them. That it's that there's a self-interest in having inclusive government. And so they remember we talked about just a moment ago that they believe that the wealthy are controlling the economy and it's not in their interest. They believe that racism is a weapon that they use. And so how do we get into that conversation? Well, what the race class project figured out is that it's possible to kind of make the statement of a common ground that's very receptive, that this persuadable portion of the population really makes sense to them, and it moves them into a conversation that is, how do we move forward beyond the racism? So here's one example that they use. We need elected leaders who will reject the divide and conquest tactics of their opponents and put the interests of working people first, whether we're white, black, or brown. So that the idea is that the place that it opens the conversation is into a conversation about how are we going to make sure that there is economic security and security in general, that how can we work towards a country that we'd like to have, and that it's in the context of it being for everyone, for whites, blacks, and browns. Here's another example. To make life better for everyone, we need to invest in education, creating better paying jobs, and making healthcare more affordable for whites, blacks, and brown people. So again, the conversation isn't to do like Bernie Sanders tried to do, to say the only thing that matters is the economy, but to say no, racism is a part of it. We all know that it's one of the tools that's used, and so that when we talk about what we would hope for, then we would hope for a country that does have economic justice, but that it is justice for all people, and that this is what the research showed, is that having this self-interest as part of the conversation opens up people to use D'Angelo's terms, that are kind of stuck in their fragility. So talking to friends, obviously it's complex, and but talking about racism benefits from our practice. So let's go back to you. Maybe I'll stop sharing. You'll need to unmute yourself. If I could lip read, I would just translate for you here.
I'm always reminding other people to unmute themselves. Thanks. I think what you've taught us in part is how important it is never to look at a human population as a monolith. There's all kinds of understandings of how we experience and interact with others. And it's not only out of our own variety of filters and experiences, but also the variety of filters and experiences of others. So that's just so vital to understanding how we talk with friends and, with one another about white fragility. So we wanted to practice that a little bit with some experiences. In the interest of time, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to share the screen and have you take a look at this question, and then together think through some ideas that we have. Let me go ahead and pull that up. Just a second here, guys, sorry. So how do we deal with our fragile white friends and loved ones? And we wanted to invite you to provide your own examples of an engagement with fragile white friends or loved ones. You might use some of the guidelines of trust building that D'Angelo talks about and thinks about. So first of all, what experience have we had, and what kind of understanding do we have now from the book study that could help us with our engagement around white fragility? We talked a little bit about that at the beginning of our class, but also I'd love us to just have just a common conversation about what does a group like this class do to help us think through our responses? You know, in many of our Christian experiences, we talk about accountability groups or groups that walk with us, whether that's an Emmaus support group or whether it's an accountability group, a small group, a Sunday school class, or a Bible study, that we can kind of come back to and say, this is, man, I really flopped this week. This was my encounter and it didn't go well at all. Or can you guys help me with some language I might be able to use as I'm confronting or loving or thinking about a loved one in my family system, that kind of thing. So I'm going to invite us, instead of going into small groups, to just share as a group now, and you can also do it through the chat if you prefer to write something out. What are some of the strategies that you have developed or thought through out of our learning time, or even out of this awareness that Ken brought us about the way the population sees and understands and expresses feelings of racism? And then also, how does this group, or how does a support group help us to do this work more effectively? Any thoughts? You can chat about it or just share by unmuting yourself.
Yes, I have thoughts. One thing in the book that really, shall we say, pointed me or jabbed me was, don't diss people. That is, she's cited, I think, a group of 12 white people with one black man, and he said simply, I'm uncomfortable, and they started saying, well, we're not racist, why are you uncomfortable? Totally ignoring to empathize with what he had said, and I think that I need to pay attention to that. Don't discount what somebody is saying, and by being so, what do I want to say, fragile, and defending myself. That was a point that I just took home.
That's awesome, Sam. Thank you. Others?
I was intrigued.
Go ahead, Linda.
I was intrigued with her conversation about how we work so hard to make a covenant that people are safe and comfortable, and yet that's what we do normally in a group like we've done every week this week. And so I'm really puzzled about what her intent was with those comments, and help me understand what she was getting at, because Claire and I are in a small group with a black woman who said, I need to know that I'm safe with you. I mean, that was, you're safe with me. So how do you establish that without kind of identifying a covenant? I'm puzzled about that. So do you do that with a friend who's fragile?
Good question. Anybody have some ideas for Linda?
No, I just wanted to say I didn't recognize Claire Holtgrew. I know you and your parents. I'll get off now.
So creating this safe space. Who does the space need to be safe for? Might be a part of the question too.
Yeah, that's good.
Mark, are you trying to get in?
Oh, I was just perhaps going to say, perhaps start with some common ground. Open-mindedness, and be sensitive, like you say, because not everyone's going to trust. I guess that's another one. But you have to start somewhere and just fake it. Blind faith, sort of. Blind faith. You have to trust each other that you're going to get things accomplished. That's all.
Linda, I think something, I don't know the size of your group or exactly the construction of it, but something you might want to consider too is that, everybody coming to the group is hopefully coming to the group because they're wanting to learn and to listen and to grow. But something that has been brought up by many people on various groups I've been in and reading in the media as well, is that it's not up to the Black community to tell us everything we need to learn about how not to be racist.
Right.
We need, as was mentioned earlier, and I can't remember who mentioned it earlier, but it's incumbent upon the white community to do our work, to do our homework. And I think that's part of it too, is that, recognizing when you're in a group with, say, one Black person and 5 white people, they're automatically going to have their barrier up a little bit. And it's up to you to help make them more comfortable. And so for that person to have said that she didn't necessarily, how do I know that I can trust you? That indicates to me, honestly, that she's been in a lot of groups where the trust was broken. So.
I think she was feeling safe with us, but she was just talking about how, in general, how it's not always safe. But D'Angelo seems to be talking about white groups need to feel safe so that they're not feeling attacked about being called upon their racism. And that's the curiosity that I have. Almost like, do we go overboard in making people feel comfortable? And yeah.
Linda, it seems like you're identifying there's a real tension between if you go all the way on one side of making someone safe, then you never call them on anything. You never hold each other accountable. It's really, this is an uncomfortable conversation, and sometimes, it doesn't feel safe. But on the other hand, if you call somebody too much, if you use words like white fragility before they're really ready to hear it, back when they're just starting this journey, then it shuts down the conversation. So is that maybe your question, is you're trying to find what the right balance is?
Yeah. Yes, very much so. Thank you.
I don't know the answer.
Something else that Ken and I talked about today is, how do we handle those moments where somebody says something racist, or we even think it ourselves, and then or let's just say in this case, somebody else says something and we're stunned and we walk away and we're like, what just happened here? Does that happen to anybody else on this class? It catches us off. It goes back to the dog whistles, right? That we learned last week from Ken. Ken, do you have some insights for that? How we might approach kind of creating that space? And Lynn's got her hand up. What do we do in those kinds of moments? Lynn, do you want to answer first, and then Ken?
Yes, I had to unmute. I had a friend over the other day whose relative lives in Georgia and said something very racist on Facebook. And he got back with her and said, these statements divide us. These are things that shouldn't be said because we're so divisive already. And of course she came back, I'm not a racist. He never even used that word. And then she unfriended him, a family order. But I liked his terminology. Instead of saying that's racist, these are words that divide us further.
I like that answer, Lynn. And I think that a piece of it is the development of our own confidence in terms of, I really like the way D'Angelo says, well, this isn't entirely about figuring out how to get other people to be non-racist, but how we can develop our own understanding of our fragility and overcome our own strategies for using white privilege and and for ignoring situations too, and that so that one of the ways to see those situations is learning opportunities for us, rather than, and so that I liked an answer that I heard recently of just using the simple phrase, well, I have a different opinion about that, so that it doesn't just say, it doesn't just let it pass as, oh, you know, of course everybody agrees because no one challenged it, but to start, that can be a starting point if you're not ready to do something more in terms of the discussion of it, to just claim a difference.
Thanks, Ken. I see Catherine's hand up. She even put the little hand up icon. That's very cool, Catherine.
Well, I tried it on the chat thing, but nobody's recognized it.
She's a former teacher.
Someone in our small group tonight, in our breakout group, used D'Angelo's word, which was interrupt. Interrupt that moment. Mm-hmm. And both what Ken said, Ken, what was it? I have a different opinion. And then the other thing that was said, that this further divides us. Either way, or many others, we could at least begin to start. Our starting point could be what the person in our group said, which was, I'm going to try more to interrupt when a racist moment comes. So I thought that was awesome.
Thank you for that, Catherine. Yeah, and that really is a D'Angelo strategy, isn't it? It's not to allow the white fragility code to continue, to interrupt that in some way. And it doesn't have to be a hostile takeover, but it can be a moment of just saying we're not going to continue to play by these rules, these white supremacist rules. Barb?
I just find too sometimes when I'm talking to people about an intense subject to ask questions. So put it out there for them to bring up their ideas first. Approach with questions.
Mm-hmm.
That's all.
Good. Thank you.
Amy, I'm kind of surprised sometimes with all of the things all of the reactions D'Angelo has gotten when she conducts these things, that she doesn't find a nice way to say, we're not talking about you. I mean, that isn't what we're here to study, or, this is the topic we're studying. I don't know, maybe there's not a nice way to say that, but when people just want to talk about something for them, it's like, but is this helping us to understand the workshop that, and what we're supposed to be learning here? So
it might be valuable, to your point, Katie, it might be valuable now to reread chapter 11, the White Women's Tears chapter. We read it with chapter 3. But we're further along in this awareness, aren't we? And how so many times from her examples, people get defensive, and then they bring the energy onto them, right? Out of those group experiences. So it might be worth rereading that and seeing if we're looking at that information through some new filters. Appreciate that. Well, friends, we typically do our quiet chat at the end of our class, which is a time to kind of talk about what we're learning and thinking. We've kind of done some of that, just more verbally tonight, which is very cool too. Would encourage you, if you'd like, to stay on for just a minute if you have some other chat ideas that you want to share, but I know others of us need to peel away. Next week is our class, and so go ahead if you have some chat ideas that you want to add right now, because that also gets included as a part of our recording. But just a reminder that next week will be our last class session on the Zoom call, and we'll be doing chapter 11. And really thinking about, some of you guys have figured out kind of some of my preaching formula is I start with the what, and then I move to the so what, and then the third part of that preaching formula is the now what. And that's also a teaching technique. Some of you who are teachers, you move from kind of offering information, helping it become relevant for folks, and then you move to the now what. So I'm sorry, next week, yes, is chapter 12. That's what Camille's clarifying. Yes, chapter 12, sorry, because we already had read chapter 11. Thanks, Camille. So next week will be chapter 12, and we'll be moving into the now what phase. And so you might be thinking about that as you're reflecting and journaling this week. Go ahead and add any other chat ideas if you'd like. And thank you, especially Ken, thank you so much for helping to frame our conversation and our understanding not only of ourselves in these white fragility conversations, but also as we're understanding who the other is that we're in conversation with. A reminder from Arvada, the Robin DiAngelo and Rasmus Menakim discussion that was on being. It's a podcast. If you want to look up that podcast, great conversation and dialogue. And then I think, was that the same one that was lifted up on PBS, or was that a different one with Robin DiAngelo? Who mentioned that one?
I did, and there was another author with her that they were talking to. That I can't remember his name.
Resma Menachem.
Thank you. Sam?
Yes. Tomorrow evening, Trinity is having a live session with Reverend Keela Bixler, who after 1 year in Douglas County, the 6th richest county in America, had enough racism and moved back to New York. So we're going to be discussing with her.
Is that going to be done on a Facebook Live, Sam?
On a Zoom chat from Trinity United Methodist Church, Reverend Deb Meyer.
So
we have a regular, what we call it, allyship on Monday evenings like this. We meet Monday evenings, and she's going to be live to talk about her experiences.
Thank you for that, Sam. So you should find information about that through the Trinity UMC website. I was Akila's mentor while she was here serving as the executive pastor at St. Andrew's United Methodist Church. Some of you read the article about her on Colorado Public Radio, CPR, and forward that to me. And she has a real hard story to tell about her experience this past year as a Black pastor, not only in a predominantly white congregation, but her experiences around racism were much more about the area than just the congregation. So would invite you to take a look at that as well. Thanks to you all. We are learning and growing together. It's a joy to do that work with you, and grateful for your time tonight. Feel free to join us next week or check us out on the recording and the PowerPoint. And again, welcome to the folks that just joined us tonight. We are glad to have you too. Be well, my friends. Take good care, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.